the main story. With just 16 hours of oxygen left on board, the missing Titan submersible search and rescue teams are desperately racing against the clock to try and save the 5 passengers on board. Contact with the vessel was lost 1 hour and 45 minutes into its dive to see the Titanic wreck on Sunday. The US and Canadian Coast Guards believe it could be stuck around the remains of the Titanic, which lie 12,500 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic. No light reaches the ocean floor at that depth. It literally is pitch black, and temperatures will hover around 0 to 3 degrees Celsius. So that, of course, is near freezing. The water pressure is 380 times greater than on land. And to put that into perspective, it's about the same as 9 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of one another. So the equivalent of being trapped under a 100-storey tower made of lead. Now, with time running out, hopes of rescuing the 5 souls on board are fading fast. I spoke earlier to Dr. Michael Guillen, former ABC News Science editor, whose terrifying experience on one of these Titanic tourist trips almost ended in tragedy. I asked him about how he came to be on board one of these submersibles in the first place.
I received an invitation in September of 2000, and the invitation came to me by way of my producer at ABC News, that I would be the first correspondent in history to report from the Titanic. Now, I had a deathly fear of water then and now, and so I had to think twice about it, but then I thought, well, you know, this is my job, and how can you pass up such an opportunity? It's an important ship. It's got a lot of important history to it, and there was an element of scientific curiosity. I wanted to report the condition of the ship. We know that it's being eaten away little by metal-eating bacteria. So I wanted to be able to report firsthand, as I do any story that I do. I've been to the North Pole, the South Pole. I've covered wars, and all for the same reason. It's just my job. And so we started off in Nova Scotia, Halifax, where many of the people who survived, many of the people whose bodies were recovered are buried. There's a whole cemetery there in Halifax. It's quite moving. So right off the bat, before we even leave land, I'm feeling the emotion of the experience. We get out to the position in the North Atlantic where the Titanic went down, and then we dove. And the dive went uneventfully. It was perfectly smooth at 2.5 hours down, corkscrew down. And we arrive at the bow of the ship. It's quite spectacular. We asked our pilot, Victor, who's a Russian. This is a Russian sub. I was on a Russian ship, the Academic Keldysh. It's a repurposed research ship. We asked the pilot to just pause for a moment of silence, a moment of prayer at the bow of the ship. I'll never forget that. And then we started touring the bow. And again, everything went well. But the problem began when we started leaving behind the bow and go across the debris field. We were very low to the ground. I could almost feel like I reached down and touched the bottom of the Atlantic. Can you imagine that?
No.
Looked like a lunar surface. It was quite something. And what caught my eye was the propeller, because when the Titanic sank, it broke into 2. The bow went straight down, the stern did a somersault, landed on its back, exposed the propeller. So I'm remarking to myself, gee, how shiny that is. It really just stands out against the kind of the moon-like surface of the Atlantic Ocean and the various shades of gray of the Titanic. But as I was marveling at the propeller, I also sensed that the speed of our submersible was increasing, and I thought that was rather odd. He really should be slowing down. We're approaching this propeller, this big propeller, much bigger than our submersible, much too fast. And later I learned, not at the time, but later I learned that we got caught up in a high-speed underwater current. They do exist down there, believe it or not. And so that rammed us right behind the blades of these giant propeller. And I knew immediately from the collision and from the huge chunks, I mean, it was really very dramatic, huge chunks of the Titanic just raining down on our little sub. I was watching all of this through a little 8-inch porthole. I knew immediately, Jeremy, that this was a life and death situation, that this was no kind of glancing blow, or this was something that was going to just blow over. I knew right then and there we were in peril.
Can you describe, because obviously this story is dominating the news networks across the world, and rightly so, 5 people trapped. We know
5
on an
people.
hourly basis that they're running out of oxygen. Can you describe conditions inside that sort of submersible? What is it like? Is it claustrophobic? Will it be dark? What are they going through right now in that confined space?
Well, I'll paint a picture for you. It's very likely dark, because the one thing you don't want is to be turning on any lights. Our submersible, one of the things that really kind of struck me, Jeremy, is when we went down, the sunlight pretty much disappeared about 400 feet. You only have to go about 400 feet. It's a matter of seconds, less than a minute. Boom, lights out, it's pitch black. And so from then on down, the only time you get to see anything is when you switch on the spotlight. And our pilot did that every now and again. Obviously, you don't want to have it on constantly for 2.5 hours in the descent. But every now and again, he would turn it on and we would glimpse, and there was no life. I mean, after you get past the benthic layer, most of the sea life, the people, so whales, dolphins, fish, they all live in the very top part of the ocean. Below that, there's relatively no life, really only 2 life forms, little rat-tail fish, very white, titanium white, and these little kind of fingery little sea stars, also very white, because there's no color, there's no sunlight, there's no color. So what happens is when you go down there, the water gets very cold very quickly. No sunlight, gets cold. So what happens is the inside of the sub starts sweating. And that's because whatever humidity there is inside the sub is condensing on the cold walls of the sub. So you can imagine that their sub is sweating. It's pitch black. Certainly don't want to light a candle. That'll use up oxygen. Maybe they have a flashlight, maybe they don't. But in all likelihood, it's very dark. I don't know how well insulated it is, so they may be feeling the cold.
I mean, you are probably one of the only people in the world, which is why we wanted to get you on, that would have an insight as to what they're going through in their minds right now. Be honest with me, did you think at that moment you were going to die?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, not right at the moment. My scientific brain kicked in right away when I realized we were in a life and death situation. You know, I've always lived by the motto, for every problem, there is an optimal solution. I've reared my son to believe that. For every problem, I've drummed it into his head. I said, son, for every problem, there is an optimal solution. Not just a solution, but an optimal solution. And so that was my default position. So I realized very quickly that there is no way out, that there was nothing anybody could do for us. Not the mothership on the surface. There was another vessel nearby, but what was I going to do?
And in fact, just to bring it to that, Michael, and I'm so grateful for you being on and sharing, we read and hear hour by hour, the oxygen's running out. There doesn't seem to be the chance to either find them, despite the noises earlier today, what will happen, blah, blah, blah. How did you, briefly, how did your vessel extricate itself from those propellers at the back of the stricken Titanic?
After the better part of an hour, what happened, there was a sudden change inside the cabin. I can't fully describe what it is, but one thing was clear. Shortly after that, everything quieted down. Up until then, Victor, our pilot, had been struggling to shake us out. So the engine was struggling, forward, backward, forward, backward. And then all of a sudden, everything fell quiet. I mean, deathly quiet. And I thought to myself, well, either this is the best news or the worst news, because maybe the engine has just completely given out. And so we are literally dead in the water, in which case, that's it. Surely you've bought the farm. I've already resigned myself by then, by the way, that this was the end. A voice came into my head, this is how it's going to end for you. I thought of my wife and so forth. So I had already resigned myself to dying down there. And I remember the thought crossing my mind that, wow, I'm actually going to join the people who died down here in the Titanic. I'm going to join them. And it was a creepy kind of feeling, a realization, but it was very real. But when this quiet happened, we hadn't wanted to talk to the pilot very much because he was intent on getting us out. And I knew by then that he was our only, if we were going to get out alive, he was the only way we were, because every other possibility just wasn't viable. So then I dared finally, when this silence continued and I felt the kind of a floating feeling, which is very unusual, I dared to ask him a one-word question. I turned to him and I said, okay? And he turned to me with this grin in a very thick Russian accent, he said, "No problem." And of course, that was the understatement of the century as far as I was concerned, because at that point, it was like I had won the lottery a million times over. And Jeremy, I tell you the truth, I don't remember ever feeling that jubilant before or since then, not even in my wedding day, and I love my wife very much. But that sense of relief is indescribable. But to know that you were on the precipice of death, you were on the threshold of death, you were resigned to it, ready to go, said your goodbyes, that suddenly you're given a second chance at life, whew, I mean, how do you describe that to somebody who hasn't gone through it?